Okay, well, why don't we get started? Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. If you are coming from outside the law school, my name is Greg Fox. I'm on the faculty here, and I also direct the program for international legal studies. And it's a real pleasure to welcome Elliot Duringer for his talk today about the upcoming Paris conference on climate change. Before I start, since I have all of you in the room here, I want to take an opportunity to plug our next event. There are flyers out on the table, but in case you didn't see those, next Thursday, October 22nd, we will have a talk on legal developments in U.S.-Cuba relations. As you probably know, there have been some rather substantial developments in U.S.-Cuba relations, and our speaker will be Anna Mellwood from the Office of Legal Advisor to the U.S. State Department. And Anna has been personally involved in quite a number of the negotiations with the Cuban government. So this will be as much of an insider account as you can get. So I urge you to come 12:15 next Thursday. The same fabulous lunch will be served. I think it's hard to find somebody who is more deeply immersed in climate change issues than Elliot Duringer. Elliot is the Executive Vice President of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions in Washington. He has worked on environmental issues of a whole variety for more than 30 years. He began as a journalist writing on environmental issues for the San Francisco Chronicle and won a number of awards for that work. He then came to Washington, and from 1997 to 2000, he served as Director of Communications and Senior Policy Advisor at the White House Council on Economic Quality, where he helped develop a number of major policy initiatives. Even after that, he was Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy Assistant and Deputy White House Press Secretary, serving as a principal spokesman for President Clinton. He's also had a little bit of experience in academia, having served as a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Elliot Duringer.
Thank you, Professor Fox. It's a pleasure to be here today. As you will have deduced from the introduction, I am neither an academic really nor a lawyer, so I'll have to ask you the easy limit. And as Professor Fox mentioned, we have a major event coming up in the climate change world, which is a conference in Paris in December called COP21. It's the 21st conference of the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It will be a pretty big deal, and I appreciate the opportunity to offer our perspective on the prospects for Paris. I'll start by just giving you a little introduction to my organization, the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, and then want to go back into the history of the climate regime a little bit, because I think it's important to understand where we find ourselves today, and then introduce what I think is the emerging paradigm for Paris. Take a look at the formal mandate for the negotiations, how the deal is shaping up across major issues, and then a quick overview of the various contributions countries are putting forward ahead of the Paris conference. These are their intended contributions to the agreement, and then focus a little more closely on some of the legal issues, both international and domestic, raised by the negotiations, and then ask and attempt to answer the question, why does Paris matter? So C2ES, actually we were formerly known as the Pew Center on Global Climate Change, transitioned in 2011, I think it was. We are an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, sometimes regarded as a think tank, but we are a think tank with an agenda, and that agenda is advancing practical and effective climate policy and action, focusing most heavily here within the United States, both at the federal and the state level, but also focusing internationally at the multilateral level. We publish quite a bit of policy analysis, and in the international context, another thing we've done over the years is play a convening role. We do a lot of informal convening of discussions among climate negotiators. And most recently, we convened a focused dialogue called the Forward 2015 Dialogue, which brought together senior climate negotiators from more than 20 countries to focus on options for Paris. We brought this group together 8 times over about 15 months, nearly 100 hours of discussions in all. And actually, these were very productive discussions. I think some of the seminal discussions that have led to the consensus that is emerging on major issues for Paris. We produced a report from that dialogue process, from the co-chairs of that process back in July. We're invited by the United States and Luxembourg to present that report at a meeting of ministers called the Major Economies Forum, and are now seeing a lot of the core elements reflected in that report being reflected in the political discussions taking place in the run-up to Paris. So let me step backward now a bit. The international climate regime was launched in 1992 with the adoption of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It is a framework convention, so it provides a foundation, almost a constitution, if you will, for the global climate regime. It established a long-term objective, which is stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that will prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. It included some commitments applying to all countries. All countries committed themselves to implement measures to mitigate climate change. It also included some commitments just for developed countries, basically to help support developing countries with finance, technology, and capacity building. The convention also established agreement around an important set of principles. So the one that we hear most about is common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, sometimes going by the acronym CBDRRC. Basically, an acknowledgement that while all countries have some level of responsibility for addressing this problem, some bear a great deal more responsibility for having created the problem, and some have a much greater capacity to actually address it. So that's the differentiated part. The convention was negotiated, the negotiations were completed at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. It was signed on behalf of the United States by the first President Bush, and the U.S. Senate unanimously provided its advice and consent. And at this point, it has nearly every country on Earth is a party to the Framework Convention. Now, from the start, there's been a certain tension, if you will, between two different models of climate governance, what we sometimes refer to as top-down versus bottom-up. And shortly after the convention came into force, parties recognized that things really weren't happening fast enough, we needed more. And that led to the negotiation of the Kyoto Protocol, which kind of took the regime in a more top-down direction. It established binding emissions targets for developed countries only, consistent with that principle of CBDRRC. But these were binding targets, internationally binding, and they were negotiated. There wasn't agreement on anyone's number until there was agreement on everybody's number. So that was the direction things were headed in 1997. You may recall that the U.S. did not ultimately ratify the Kyoto Protocol, and the initial targets ran through 2012, and when it came time to negotiate a second round of targets under the Kyoto Protocol, some other countries decided not to do that. Japan, Canada had withdrawn, Japan and Russia decided they wouldn't be taking new targets. So as a consequence, you had shrinking participation. You did get a second round of targets. At this point, they cover just a little more than 10% of the global emissions. So a good run at it, but at the end, not terribly effective. So recognizing that Kyoto wasn't going to be the basis going forward, there emerged a parallel framework under the convention. Parties tried to come up with something that would engage the United States as well as the major developing countries. This emerged first at the Copenhagen Conference in 2009 and was formalized the following year in Cancun. And this alternative framework was a much more bottom-up approach. It effectively involved voluntary pledges rather than binding targets, and left countries a great deal of discretion in terms of the type of commitment or pledge that they were going to offer. The result was a great deal more participation. You now have nearly 100 countries that have put forward pledges under this Copenhagen-Cancun framework. Unfortunately, the pledges on the whole are pretty weak when you add them all up. They don't nearly put us on the pathway to limiting warming to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, which is the target that the international community agreed on. So we have a great deal of history now, a lot of experience. We've tried different things under this convention. We've tried the bottom-up direction, we've tried the top-down direction. With Kyoto, we've got a strong agreement with a strong legal and technical rigor, but as I said, shrinking participation. With the parallel bottom-up approach, you got stronger participation but still weak goals. So both models really have shown some virtues and some merits. The bottom line is neither one was really getting the job done. So as we head, this is just to give you a sense of the coverage of these two approaches. The darkest blue there shows the countries that have targets under the Kyoto Protocol at this point. So as you can see, it's mostly Europe. The 2 middle shades of blue are countries that have put forward pledges under the Copenhagen and Cancun framework, and the lightest shade are countries that have no pledges at all, primarily in Africa. So it just gives you a sense of the coverage of these agreements. But as we head toward Paris, there's been a lot of learning that's taken place. And the paradigm that's emerged is what we refer to as a hybrid paradigm. It's something that would blend some top-down elements and some bottom-up elements to strike a balance between national flexibility on the one hand and international discipline on the other hand, with the aim of producing both broad participation and strong ambition. That, I think, is the broad conceptual aim that we're trying to achieve with the Paris Agreement. This I include just because it's nice to have pictures and a little animation, so it's just a graphic way of reflecting this notion of bottom-up and top-down, national flexibility on the one hand, international discipline on the other. It sort of situates the existing agreements along that spectrum, and as you can see down at the bottom and middle, what we're aiming for is something in the middle there, a hybrid. So that's the conceptual approach that I would describe. The negotiations, of course, start with a formal mandate from the parties. And this came in Durban in 2011, when the Conference of the Parties adopted something called the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action. And what that did was launch a process. This phrase in quotes here is really the operative language here. They launched a process to develop a protocol, another legal instrument, or an agreed outcome with legal force under the convention applicable to all parties. You have to understand that ministers negotiated through the night to arrive at this formulation, but then it actually, the final wording wasn't agreed until there was this massive huddle on the floor of the plenary. It was quite an affair. So you can unpack that phrase and see the nuances that parties incorporated here. It suggests that the outcome must have legal force, but is open as to the specific legal form. It says applicable to all parties, which some countries, like the U.S., interpreted as ending a so-called firewall between developed and developing countries. And it's under the convention, which others feel very strongly means that all of the principles, if not the provisions of the convention, must apply. And it said that this is to be concluded this year, 2015, and it will apply from 2020. So while we're trying to wrap up this agreement this year, it's not actually going to apply for a few years. It leaves time for ratification and entry into force. So that's the framing, the formal framing for these negotiations. Frankly, rather loose. Now, a couple of years later, as the negotiations were proceeding, the Conference of Parties met again in Warsaw this time, and adopted a decision inviting parties to put forward their intended nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement. And again, we spent a lot of time on the wording here. The fact that these contributions are to be nationally determined reflects the bottom-up nature of this agreement. A country's specific contribution, its target, whatever policies it's planning to put forward, it will get to determine on its own. That won't be negotiated. The fact that they're called contributions reflects the ambivalence at that stage in the negotiations about the precise legal character those contributions will take. And in fact, the decision was quite explicitly without prejudice to the legal nature of those contributions, an issue, as I'll note later, that's still open. So that's the formal mandate. We saw clues in Warsaw about the bottom-up elements still to be decided, or the top-down elements. So how are the negotiations shaping up? So my perspective here is informed in part by that informal dialogue of negotiators that we convened, but also by the political discussions taking place among ministers within the Major Economies Forum, which I've had a chance to observe and help facilitate in the last couple of meetings, and also the ministerial consultations that are being convened by the French and Peruvian governments running up to Copenhagen. And in the official summaries that come out of those discussions, I see a lot of convergence with the ideas reflected in that negotiators' dialogue report that I referred to earlier. So first, the structure of the agreement. The outcome in Paris is going to be a package. There's going to be the core legal agreement, which is what I'm going to focus on primarily. There will also be one or more COP decisions supporting the agreement, laying out some of the details, probably initiating processes to further negotiate other details. And then there will probably be some other instrument that actually houses these nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, that the countries put forward. The core agreement, as we saw from the mandate, is supposed to have legal force. It's generally accepted that it will be of a legally binding form. It will constitute a treaty under the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. One thing that the agreement will speak to is the long-term direction of the climate effort. As I noted, there is the convention itself lays out this long-term objective, stabilizing greenhouse gases. In Copenhagen, parties did adopt that 2-degree goal as well. Likely the agreement will reaffirm that 2-degree goal, but there's also strong interest in including something that helps translate that into a more action-oriented goal. There's a concern that just saying 2 degrees doesn't give people a strong enough sense of what it is we actually need to do. So people are looking at words like decarbonization of the global economy in the course of the century, carbon neutrality, climate neutrality, things of that sort. So that's one question, is just how will those notions be captured in the agreement? Now, historically, really the core of this effort has been mitigation, reducing greenhouse gases. And for many people, that's the most important thing you need to see in this agreement is a new structure guiding countries' efforts on mitigation. In keeping with what I have described as a hybrid approach, the agreement will allow countries significant flexibility in defining their own contributions. Again, this notion of nationally determined contributions. But the aim is also to establish some rules and norms that will bound that flexibility to some degree to promote stronger accountability and stronger ambition over time. Now, I said it will be a legally binding agreement. I think it's probably a fair bet that some of the binding provisions will be procedural requirements, procedural commitments. Countries will be required to make a contribution and to maintain that contribution and to periodically report on their progress in implementing that contribution. and to periodically update that contribution. One significant open question is whether the contributions themselves, the targets, will be legally binding under international law, a point I'll come back to. Now, another major issue running through the negotiations over the years is differentiation. How do you distribute the effort across countries, specifically between developed and developing countries? Again, that principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. As we saw in the case of Kyoto, there was a very stark binary differentiation. Binding targets for developed, no new commitments for development. This agreement, I think, will take a much more nuanced approach to differentiation, and it will be determined more on a de facto basis by self-differentiation. As countries put forward their nationally determined contributions, they will naturally fall along a spectrum. So rather than on the basis of explicit categories of countries as the regime has done in the past. This, I would note, would be actually a pretty significant shift in the approach, a historic shift in the approach under this regime. Now, a lot of what this new agreement will provide will be achieved through transparency. That will be the means of holding countries accountable. We've had various transparency mechanisms under the convention over the years. Countries report on their missions, on their policies. We've had different types of reviews of what's being reported. But this has always been defined, again, on a bifurcated basis. Different requirements are developed in developing countries. What will be different this time is that the agreement will likely establish a common transparency framework, so transitioning beyond that bifurcated approach. It will have some flexibility because countries obviously have varying capacities. Some are much more capable to report in detail. So you'll have that kind of built-in flexibility, but the idea is that over time, everyone is working toward the same standards of accountability. Another critical issue is ambition. The contributions, the intended contributions that countries have been coming forward with, again, will not put us immediately on a pathway to be within that 2-degree goal. So if we are to feel at all confident that the agreement is actually serving to deliver ambition, it needs a mechanism. And what's emerging is convergence around the idea that the agreement will require countries to come back to the table periodically, probably every 5 years, undertake an assessment of collective progress, and then be required to say what they're going to do next. So each country would be obligated to update its contribution. Having put forward initial contribution, having reported on the progress they're making, they'll now need to say, okay, what are you going to do next? And this will probably be accompanied by some expectation, probably not an obligation, but a norm or expectation. The parties will progress in their efforts, either in the type of contribution they're making, the scope of it. Many have economy-wide contributions, but some are just covering certain sectors, or in the scale of that contribution. So this is an agreement that I think more than the past will rely on norms and expectations. This will be one of the more important ones. Some talk about no backsliding, some talk about forward progression. We'll see where that lands. Another perennial issue is finance. How do we mobilize the support needed for developing countries? Again, developed countries have a commitment under the 92 Convention to provide finance, technology, and capacity building support to developing countries. It's been a struggle from the start to scale that up. There was an agreement in Copenhagen and Cancun to set a goal of mobilizing $100 billion a year by 2020. This is to include both public and private resources. There has been a lot of debate over whether or not we're on track to meeting that goal, in part because there are no agreed set of definitions for what counts, particularly in terms of private finance being mobilized. There was a new report put out just last week by the OECD, providing some methodologies and accounting, suggesting that in fact we are on track to achieving that $100 billion by 2020. But a couple of the issues that are being debated in the context of the Paris Agreement are who should be providing support, and should we set another numerical goal beyond 2020? While developed countries have the binding obligation, a number of developing countries in recent years have started to provide support as well. There was a recent joint announcement by the United States and China on climate change, and one piece of that was China pledging to provide $3 billion through a new fund that it's created called the South-South Fund. So China and others are, even though they're not obligated under the convention, they're beginning to step up with some contributions of their own. So it's been a high priority for the developed countries to use the agreement to try to further enlarge the donor base so that the onus is not entirely on them, and probably the agreement will speak to that in some fashion. It won't obligate developing countries, but by acknowledging their contributions, it will try to encourage them to provide more. But there is really a major division at this moment over whether the agreement will establish any numerical goal for finance beyond 2020. The developed countries are resisting that very strenuously at the moment. Personally, I think it's hard to picture getting out of Paris without that agreement including some quantitative aim for mobilizing finance in the years beyond 2020. Finally, the question of adaptation. As I said, the regime has historically focused primarily on the mitigation side of the climate equation. How do we reduce emissions? I think we've all come to recognize, though, that that's only part of the challenge. At this point, we have committed ourselves to a certain degree of warming. We're beginning to feel the impacts, and we all need to be taking steps to adapt to a warmer world. So there's a very strong push from developing countries to give greater emphasis in this agreement to adaptation, and I expect that the agreement will. It will do things like requiring countries to report on what they're doing. It will try to articulate some long-term vision. We have this long-term goal on the mitigation side, but there's an effort to try to articulate at least a qualitative vision on the adaptation side, and it will probably establish some kind of regular process to assess progress and to provide for some learning, some sharing of experiences and lessons. So very important politically for a lot of countries that adaptation be seen on par with mitigation in this agreement. So that's an overview of the major issues and how we see things shaping up for this agreement. As I said, countries have been coming forward with their intended nationally determined contributions, their INDCs. As of last week, we had about 150 from 150 countries, accounting for nearly 90% of global emissions. That's really very encouraging that so many have put these forward ahead of Paris. And again, countries have very broad latitude in deciding for themselves not only the level of commitment, but the form of their contribution. Most of them do establish some form of emission reduction target. Some of those are absolute targets, in other words, calling for absolute reductions in emission levels. A number of others are what we call intensity-based targets. They aim to reduce emissions per GDP, carbon intensity. China, for instance, and India have intensity targets. And quite a few, from most of the smaller developing countries, are what we call BAU targets. They aim to reduce emissions from business as usual, BAU, from where they would otherwise be. This is probably the loosest form of emissions target. It's obviously just a projection of where emissions would otherwise be, so it's a little hard to know just how to assess those targets and to track how they're doing. I mean, you're tracking your progress against a projection as opposed to a hard number. Countries, there was no agreement on what the period for these contributions would be, Most of them have pegged their contributions to 2030. There are a few exceptions, including the United States, which put forward a target for 2025. Some of the contributions, again, from developing countries are either fully or partly conditional. Some say, here's what we can do on our own, here's what more we could do if we receive some international support. And some actually have made their contributions conditional on the existence of market mechanisms, international market mechanisms. And quite a few countries have indicated that they intend to use market mechanisms to achieve their contributions. So a great deal of diversity in the contributions that we've seen coming forward. And again, that flexibility is intended in part as a way to encourage broad participation, and I think it's doing that. Now, this, I said that the numbers that are coming in, the numbers that are on the table, aren't going to put us on that 2-degree pathway. The blue band at the top is where we are headed without any new contributions. The light green is the pathway we ought to be on in order to stay within the 2-degree goal. That red band is an estimate of where the contributions put us. So as you can see, better than the business as usual pathway, perhaps significantly better, but still a considerable gap between the numbers that countries are coming forward with and the pathway that would keep us within the 2-degree goal. So let me now turn to some of the specific legal issues raised by all of this, focusing first on the international side of the legal questions. First point, there's a lot of interest among some in terms of is this a protocol, what is it, and really it doesn't matter what you call it. What's important are the provisions of the agreement itself in terms of determining its legal character. So the Vienna Convention defines a treaty as an international agreement concluded between states in written form and governed by international law, whatever its particular designation. You could call it whatever you want. Now, the term protocol is favored by some because they liked the Kyoto Protocol and they want to have assurance that it has the same legal rigor, and disliked by others. You can imagine in the United States, we'd probably rather not reference back to the Kyoto Protocol. So sometimes the preferences for names have a lot more to do with optics than with any legal significance. It's important to distinguish between the legal form of the agreement and the legal character of its particular elements. So an agreement may be a legally binding agreement, but some of its provisions might not be legally binding. The Framework Convention, for instance, is technically a legally binding agreement, and countries did take on some binding commitments. They were quite general. There was a specific aim in the 92 Convention for developed countries to reduce their emissions to 1990 levels by 2000, something we didn't achieve. But again, it was an aim, and that was not binding. So an example of how a legally binding agreement can include both binding and non-binding provisions. So coming back to the particular question of whether countries' targets or contributions will be legally binding under the Paris Agreement. If, for instance, the agreement were to bind parties to implement or achieve their contributions, that would be regarded as making those contributions legally binding. This was an issue we spent quite a bit of time on within our negotiators' dialogue, and there were some who felt very strongly that making the NDCs legally binding provides greater confidence that they will actually be fulfilled. But we also heard people just as adamant that making those contributions binding would deter some countries from participating, and also would discourage ambition. If countries' targets were binding, then they would be likely to put forward less ambitious targets. My personal expectation is that at the end of the day, the targets will not be legally binding. And as I move into the domestic side of the legal issues, it may become a little more apparent why. If this is going to be a treaty under international law, legally binding, there will arise the question of how the U.S. Will choose to ratify, if the U.S. will ratify, by what means. U.S. law recognizes different routes for acceptance of an international agreement. We are all most familiar with the process of advice and consent from the Senate that's outlined in Article 2 of the Constitution. Those types of agreements are typically referred to as Article 2 treaties. But it turns out that they actually represent the minority of international agreements to which the United States is a party. There's a whole other category of executive agreements of different types. There are congressional executive agreements, which might involve approval either before or after the negotiation by both houses of Congress. Many of our trade agreements have been approved in that way. There are treaty executive agreements where the president has the authority to ratify on his own because the agreement comes under an existing treaty. In this case, we do have the Framework Convention. And then there are presidential executive agreements where the president is relying both on his constitutional and his legislative statutory authorities. There are quite a few examples of agreements, some of them rather major and historic, that have been approved in that way. The Alta Agreement, the Paris Peace Accords. Within the environmental realm, you've had the long-range transboundary, I know it's a long-range transboundary agreement. And most recently, this was within the last year or two, the president ratified the Minamata Convention on Mercury on his own, using his executive authority. And it really is up to the president to choose which route to go. So we've undertaken a legal analysis of these options. And here I am drawing heavily on that legal analysis, which was done for us by Dan Verdansky at Arizona State University. And what it concludes is that the president would likely be on firm legal ground ratifying the Paris Agreement using his executive authority if the agreement is implementing the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which it obviously will be, and that could include binding procedural commitments of the type I described earlier. But the agreement would also need to be consistent with and able to be implemented under existing U.S. law. If, on the other hand, the agreement were to include a binding emissions target or a binding financial commitment, it would arguably have to go before the Senate or the full Congress to be ratified or accepted. We have no basis in U.S. domestic law for an economy-wide emissions target. What the U.S. has put forward is a reduction of 26 to 28% from 2005 levels by 2025. And that is effectively a projection of where the administration thinks we can be using the various regulatory tools at its disposal, primarily under the Clean Air Act. But there is no basis in current legislation for the administration to actually set an economy-wide target as a matter of domestic law. So if that were to be a binding target under international law, the president couldn't ratify it on his own. And as far as the financial commitment, obviously Congress has the power of the purse. So again, if the agreement contained a binding financial commitment, that would be beyond the president's authority to ratify on his own. We have to look forward, of course. Many things that presidents undertake are subject to challenge, either legally or politically. As I understand, there's not a whole lot of case law speaking to the president's authority on these matters, but in the few cases that do exist, Courts have deferred to the president on the political question of which needs of ratification to pursue. And there's also the question of standing. In order to challenge the president's ratification of an agreement, you'd have to be able to show that you've suffered harm. And really, if your concern is about the domestic regulations through which the United States intends to reach its target, then more likely you would have standing going after the regulations and going after the Paris Agreement. Now, with a presidential election approaching, it's not unreasonable to ask whether a future president might be able to undo the Paris Agreement, and the answer is yes. But that's the case regardless of the means by which the U.S. chooses to ratify the agreement. No matter how we have ratified, either the president or Congress, frankly, can override that and withdraw the U.S. from that agreement. So that remains a potential outcome as well. So let me just conclude by asking the question, why does Paris matter? What would constitute success in Paris? We have had examples in the past of negotiations that have reached what I would consider a reasonably successful outcome, but were considered a failure because of the expectations people had going into those negotiations. And I would cite the Copenhagen Conference as the prime example. Even though the mandate for Copenhagen did not explicitly call for a legally binding agreement, there was an expectation created that that would be the outcome. I didn't share that expectation. It's pretty clear to me that we couldn't get there. And we didn't. The Copenhagen Accord was a political agreement, not a legally binding outcome. But because of the expectation that had been set, I think effectively Copenhagen was doomed to be perceived as failure. Going into Paris, if you look at some of the conventional criteria that we might employ to judge its success, you would have to conclude that it falls short. Again, I've already mentioned the 2-degree goal. Paris will not immediately put us on a pathway to a 2-degree goal, so if that's the measure of success, it would take us a long time to know whether Paris actually delivered a success. It would not in that instant. And again, if your expectation is that targets will be legally binding, you would not consider Paris a success. For me, though, I think the kind of agreement that we see emerging from Paris would in fact be a significant step forward. I think Paris can, for the first time really, establish a durable, a lasting international framework that gets all of the major players on board, that provides for strong accountability, and that works to raise ambition over time. For me, those will be the measures of success for Paris. And the reason I think that provides added value is because it will help instill confidence that everyone's doing their fair share. And it's only when we have that confidence that all are doing their fair share that each of us is in a position to do more. So in some respects, I view this all as a confidence building exercise. And I think the kind of agreement we're seeing taking shape will provide that confidence and will provide a foundation for stronger efforts over time. So with that, just one last thing I would mention. We've produced, as I said, quite a bit of analysis. We have the report from our dialogue, Vision from Paris, a couple of papers looking at the international legal issues as well as the specific issues around U.S. options for ratification, quite a few other policy briefs dealing with different aspects of the negotiations. All of that available online, and look forward to your questions.
Wonderful, thanks very much. Yes? So, Elliot, it's time to agree to take questions. If you do have a question, please raise your hand, and we have a wireless mic that will get in front of you, so your question can be recorded. recorded along with his answer. Okay, the question?
Thank you, most interesting. Appreciate your being here. In the one slide on the national objectives that are preliminary and goals, you mentioned that there's 4 states that are proposing, I believe, intensity-related, yes, emission standards compared to those that are absolute. And one of those states, I believe you said, is China. Could you please discuss and differentiate between absolute and intensity-based, and then provide your analysis for the prospects for China actually making progress on their enormous emissions problem?
Sure. I should add that in the case of China, in addition to their intensity target, their intended contribution also includes a peaking of emissions. So they've said they will try to peak around 2030 or sooner. That you might interpret as an absolute target as well, because it speaks to capping their absolute emissions, but it's not a numerical absolute target. So again, just to better differentiate between absolute and intensity-based. An absolute target is a commitment to reduce your emissions by a certain percentage from a certain base year by a target year. So you are achieving a measurable reduction of emissions. I mean, you could either quantify that in terms of metric tons, but typically it's a percentage reduction from a base year. An intensity goal is that we will reduce our emissions intensity or carbon intensity, in other words, emissions per unit of GDP, again, usually from a base year to a target year. So that does not guarantee the same level of reduction. Depending on what's happening with your GDP, you may get more or less reduction. I mean, it also may in fact allow for an increase in emissions depending on your GDP growth. So it provides a country a lot more wiggle room, a lot more flexibility. And if you're a developing country, either undergoing significant GDP growth or less confident about your ability to project your GDP growth, then that kind of target may be more appealing. Most of the analysis that I've seen of China's intended contribution suggests that it will require effort beyond business as usual, but is achievable. And that probably with strong efforts, China could go even further than is reflected in the contribution they've put forward.
Related to the China question, I'm wondering, a lot was made over the agreement announced between President Obama and President Xi. I'm wondering, did that actually lead to some real progress, or at least the idea amongst the negotiators that this was a real thawing of this big impediment? And related to that, I'm wondering how the U.S. domestic political situation is viewed. We have the Clean Power Plan that's been announced, but whether that will survive legal challenges, whether or not we can actually implement that. So is the U.S., I guess under President Obama, viewed as a serious player in the international community, a serious player that's willing to make these actual reductions?
So there were actually 2 joint announcements from the U.S. and China. First in November of last year, so almost a year ago, where they each effectively pre-announced their intended contributions. That was where we first learned of the U.S. target and of China's intent to peak its emissions. And then there was a more recent announcement last month when they were both in New York. And yes, those, particularly the November announcement, did inject significant political momentum into the negotiations. It's very hard to imagine an agreement coming together without the U.S. and China on board. May not be sufficient, but they're necessary. So to see the both of them addressing this issue at the highest level and being proactive, getting their numbers out there early, really did help to propel the sense that we're on track toward a Paris Agreement. In the more recent joint announcement, They went beyond outlining their respective domestic intentions and spoke to some of the issues in the negotiations. So you began to see there some stronger convergence between the U.S. and China on how the agreement should actually address certain issues. So again, the fact that China spoke to its $3 billion pledge to the South-South Fund was a strong indication that the agreement itself will acknowledge those types of contributions. So all of that, I think, has been really helpful. In terms of the U.S. political situation, over the years, negotiators from other countries have developed a very, very sophisticated understanding, not just of our political system, but of the political dynamic here in the United States, and they follow this very closely. And, I think they recognize that there are uncertainties around the ability of the United States to actually meet the target that the president has put forward. We have an election coming up. There are legal challenges to the Clean Power Plan that would be the primary means of delivering on that target. But the U.S. is not alone in terms of having uncertainties of that sort. You look at the case of Japan, for instance, where they've had a great deal of difficulty meeting their targets in the wake of the Fukushima disaster. You have extraordinary circumstances like that, but many countries, they just for a variety of reasons, face policy uncertainty. So that's something that people have come to accept. I do think that it's well recognized in other governments that this administration is doing all it can within the political constraints and within its existing authorities to push forward the climate agenda, both domestically and in the negotiations toward Paris. So I think there's a recognition and appreciation that the president is committed to doing what he can in getting a strong agreement in Paris, and a recognition that there's no way of knowing what the future holds.
Hi. So I recently read a short article about the Divest Invest movement. I'm just going to reference my phone here, saying that it's grown to 2,000 plus individuals, 436 institutions, 43 countries, representing 2.3 trillion in assets. Can you comment on how that affects this whole thing? Because I'm assuming that's private industry, and in what ways our government and other governments are working with these private investors, and how is that calculated into these figures, et cetera? Just comment on that.
So one dimension of Paris that I didn't mention actually is the role of non-state actors. There's a very strong effort underway to provide a platform in Paris to provide stronger recognition of the contributions from what the states call non-state actors, which includes subnational governments, states and provinces, includes the private sector, includes civil society. So you've seen a lot of commitments coming from non-state actors in the run-up to Paris, and you'll see that given a lot of attention in Paris, and I think on the whole that's actually a really wonderful development, because in the end, while this is a multilateral negotiation and it will be agreement among states, it's going to require the commitment and efforts of everyone across society in order to be able to achieve those commitments. In the case of the push for divestment, I think that certainly enters into the calculation of individual governments in terms of what they're able to deliver. So it's a very good way of drawing attention, of highlighting the need and highlighting the commitment of all of the people who are signing on to that effort to take the actions that they can take to help steer us into the low carbon transition. I think that gives governments greater confidence that this can be done, and really just helps to reinforce the overall dynamic. I'll just mention one of the things we do in our work is we work closely with a lot of major companies. We have affiliated with us a Business Environmental Leadership Council. And this is a group of large companies across the sectors. Many of them are major emitters, or their products create a lot of emissions. We have oil companies, utilities, high-tech, finance, mining companies. So these are not the obvious winners in a carbon-constrained world. These are many of these companies face significant challenges in a low-carbon transition. They're going to have to work hard to adapt their business strategies and their business models to surviving and prospering in a carbon-constrained world. But there are also companies that recognize that climate change is real and are committed to helping achieve that low-carbon transition. Tomorrow, we'll actually be releasing a statement signed by a number of companies supporting a Paris Agreement and laying out the rationale from a business perspective of why an agreement of the sort that we envision will help them contribute more to that effort.
I guess just following up on that point, the U.S. target of, I think it was a reduction of, what, 27% or something of 2005 emission levels by 2025. Can you just comment briefly about what that will look like in terms of domestic policy? Does that figure represent more or less the Obama administration's current proposals for moving forward, or would it require significant changes in how we're implementing the Clean Air Act and other domestic policies?
The major piece of that would be the Clean Power Plan recently adopted by EPA, which establishes for the first time limits on carbon emissions from U.S. power plants, which are a major source of emissions in the United States. So at this point, that regulation is final, but under the Clean Air Act, implementation is typically delegated to the states. So we now need the states to come up with their implementation plans. If they fail to do so, or if they come in with plans that EPA doesn't find adequate, then EPA will have to step in and regulate the utilities within those states on its own. So that is going to take a couple of years to see how that unfolds. There already are legal challenges, both for some states and for some utilities. We'll have to see how the court cases unfold. So, that's one of the major dimensions of policy uncertainty is how quickly and how readily the Clean Power Plan will be implemented. Other pieces of how we'll get to that 26 to 28% reduction are some additional controls on methane emissions. Some of that's still in the works. Some additional controls on HFCs. It reflects other regulations that are already in place, improved efficiency, for instance. It relies in part on the greenhouse gas standards for automobiles that require improved fuel economy. So it's really a conglomeration of various regulatory actions that have been taken and in some cases are anticipated. Also folds in the types of efforts that states are undertaking on their own. When we tried adding up the numbers from the known and anticipated policies, we didn't quite get to the 26 to 28%. And the administration hasn't provided a very detailed accounting, actually, of how they see all those things adding up to that. I think one can be hopeful about overachievement. We've managed that in some cases. You can also be hopeful that there will be technological advances that will make it easier to achieve the goal that we might anticipate now. So I view it as a stretch goal, frankly, based on the existing legal authorities. To go much further than that will probably require new legislation.
You spoke a little bit about how private oil industries are starting to recognize the need for some control and encouraging negotiations with the Paris meeting. I was wondering to what extent some of the larger oil-producing nations are participating in the talks, as from the map you showed, a lot of the OPEC kind of areas have not adapted anything from Kyoto to Cancun. So I was hoping that you could discuss where they are at this moment.
So, pretty much everyone is participating in the negotiations. I don't think we've yet seen an INDC from Saudi Arabia, which historically over the years has often been regarded as one of the more obstructionist parties in this process. I have to say that they don't appear to be playing that role quite as much this time around. There's still a little time left, so we'll see in the end. I'm reasonably confident that they will put forward a contribution. We'll see what it looks like. At this point, frankly, the U.S. is a major oil producer, right? And I think we're pretty well on board to getting that agreement. This is a struggle for countries that are very heavily dependent on fossil fuels. I think they've come to a much better appreciation over the years that they need to be thinking about diversifying their economies. And you have seen some countries within the Gulf region, like the UAE, being more forward in that regard and taking a more progressive role in the negotiations. But again, the design of this agreement leaves it to countries to determine their own contributions. So there's nothing that really mandates a given level of reduction from any country. Hopefully, it encourages stronger action over time. Hopefully, we'll see it from all the major oil-producing states.
You've mentioned the importance of China and the United States having had some sort of contract to key players. Obviously, there's also emphasis on economics, finance, etc. Which brings to mind TPP, sort of quite largely the Obama administration recently. I'm curious if China's maintained a rather cool, maybe even different front regarding the TPP, but I'm curious if maybe explicitly or implicitly in these Paris negotiations, if an agreement such as the TPP is having any sort of positive and or negative maybe ripple effect. It at least has a facade of environmental concern. Whether or not those are binding, I'm not an expert to speak on, but I wonder if you have any thoughts.
Nor am I, I'm afraid. I'm not sure. I haven't put any thought to the potential connections or interplay between those two. I think one of the benefits of the U.S. and China coming more eye to eye on climate is that at a time when the countries seem to have so many areas of difference, I think both have appreciated an area where they can demonstrate they're acting together. And climate change has provided that. So I think that's been good for bilateral relations, and it's been good for advancing action on climate change. How that may relate to the TPP, I'm afraid I couldn't suggest.
How do you hold non-state actors accountable if they have more to lose in a carbon-constrained world than they have more to gain?
How do you hold them accountable? So, it's an interesting question, and when people first started talking about providing greater recognition for non-state actors in this process, there was a question of whether you could consider their contributions as additional to the contributions that the countries themselves are putting forward. And I think generally people recognize that would require a level of accounting beyond what we have the capacity to provide. Countries are focusing very heavily on creating better accounting of national governments, which is really critical. I don't think there was much of an appetite for creating sort of a parallel system to hold the non-state actors accountable in a rigorous sense for the commitments or contributions that they're offering as well. But I think more generally, companies in the category of non-state actors. They're held accountable by public opinion. And when an actor, whether it's a state actor or a non-state actor, stands up and puts forward a commitment, it puts itself on the record, and it falls to citizens, civil society to hold them accountable. So for me, that's it's one of the reasons it's important for us to help get companies standing up and speaking out about Paris and saying that they support this kind of this type of effort because they're putting themselves on the record, and we can try to hold them accountable in the future for that. And the emphasis on transparency in this agreement. One of the benefits of that transparency is that it better enables everyone, not just other governments, but all of us in civil society to hold those countries accountable. So I think that's how we do it. We make things transparent. And in the case of companies, not just their commitments, but a lot of them report on their emission levels either to the government or to something called CDP. It used to be called the Carbon Disclosure Project. This is voluntary reporting, very detailed reporting on their emissions. So that's one means of transparency. The more transparency we can create around all of this, the easier it is for all of us to hold the important players accountable.
You said earlier that the agreement will help enlarge the donor base by recognizing support for developing countries. I was just wondering if there was already a plan written up on how they plan on doing that. Because there are places where they can't afford cheap medicine for basic diseases. So I was wondering if are we just going to go in to help them, support them medically in that way so that they can focus more on the environment? Or how is that going to work?
So there are many different channels through which support is provided. A lot of developed countries provide support directly, bilaterally, to developing countries. One of the outcomes from Copenhagen and Cancun was the establishment of a new fund called the Green Climate Fund, which is now up and running. Actually, very soon they're supposed to be approving the first projects for funding through the Green Climate Fund. And that's intended to be the primary channel for delivering multilateral support to developing countries, both for mitigation efforts and for adaptation efforts. But you also have all the multilateral development banks, which have been trying to mainstream climate into their programs. So there's a whole range of channels through which the support is provided, which is part of the reason that it's kind of tricky to rigorously account for the level of support being provided. It's rather dispersed, and particularly when you try to take into account the private finance that is leveraged by some of the public giving. It's a little tricky to account for those flows, but there's really a wide range of channels for mobilizing that support.
Sorry, just maybe piggybacking off of that, have you seen any countries that have prioritized providing financial support in lieu of committing to take farther and do more progressive steps on their own emissions?
I have not seen that. I mean, the expectation is that everyone is putting forward a mitigation contribution addressing their own emissions. There was quite a bit of debate last year among parties about whether these NDCs should also include an adaptation component and a finance component. That was pretty strongly resisted by the developed countries. They didn't really want to, on the finance piece, they didn't want to be forced to have to put forward an individual commitment to finance. So the expectation is that everybody's putting forward something addressing mitigation, their own emissions, and this is not a requirement, but the expectation is that all of them put forward some unconditional mitigation contribution. Quite a few have also described what they're going to be doing in terms of adaptation, but the developed countries are extremely reluctant to commit to a given individually to a level of financial support. They'll talk about what they've done, and they will describe in non-quantitative terms the types of support they intend to provide in the future. But again, this $100 billion goal is a collective goal, and it was really critical to the outcome in Copenhagen. But it's also created a lot of headaches for developed countries, and as I mentioned, there's some strong resistance even to articulating a collective goal post-2020.
Well, maybe I can wrap things up with one question of my own, which actually brings us to legal issues. And it goes to the question of binding versus non-binding at Paris, either in whole or in part. And I recognize the constraints developed in Copenhagen, which was called for, is it Copenhagen an overall legal instrument or something equivalent?
Durban.
Durban, okay, sorry. I mean, it seems to me that the way you describe the arguments in favor of a legally binding commitment were really almost rhetorical, that the parties would demonstrate a seriousness of purpose, and there would be a seriousness of purpose going forward out of Paris if these were legally binding, that they're ones that should be taken more seriously than the non-binding agreements. But strictly speaking, under international law, the difference between binding and non-binding is not that great. I mean, there's virtually no chance that anybody's going to bring a lawsuit for violation of a binding agreement. Very little chance that there are any sort of sanctions for violation of a non-binding agreement. It really all seems to play out in the realm of political psychology. And so given that reality, and then given the rather substantial downside in the United States of having to approve a binding agreement, I wonder if the argument is made that this is almost a no-brainer. You can get a kind of energetic, enthusiastic political commitment in ways that don't preclude the United States from entering into the agreement.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've heard anybody describe it as a no-brainer, because that might suggest to your interlocutors that they have no brain benefit.
I trust the diplomats to be more diplomatic.
The debate we had within our negotiators dialogue at times did seem to veer into the philosophical. I share your perspective. I think it's more about optics and perceptions than about our realities. And if we all believe that binding is more binding, then maybe it is more binding, but we can point to examples where it hasn't guaranteed compliance, right? And we can also point to examples where voluntary agreements have produced results. I've asked around as to whether there's a good empirical study on the effects of binding versus non-binding agreements. I haven't come across it yet. But for instance, in the case of the Kyoto Protocol, which theoretically was a binding agreement, Canada's emissions kept going up, and what they do, they withdrew. Okay, so the fact that it was a binding agreement didn't necessarily change behavior there. Under the Copenhagen and Cancun structure, the U.S. made a pledge reducing emissions to 17% by 2020. That pledge has no standing in either domestic or international law. It's a number that was articulated. But it established a benchmark that the international community uses to hold the U.S. accountable. And it established a benchmark that this administration has used to drive action forward. So an example there of a non-binding target that I think arguably is having some practical effect. I think that even those who continue to push within these negotiations for binding targets know where the landing zone is. It's not entirely clear to me why they're still holding out. I'm sure they have some vision of how that can be traded for something. It's a negotiation, right? But I think that there's a certain ambivalence. Other countries really, really want the United States in the agreement. On the other hand, they don't necessarily want to capitulate to everything the United States says it needs in order to be in agreement. So I think there's a bit of sort of coming to terms with that.
Well, you join me in thanking Elliot for a really wonderful
Appreciate all the great questions. Thanks.